welcome to Design Age of Experience. This is the second session, and we wanted to actually get into a very specific topic that is called matter. But to introduce this day around matter, we may basically start with a broader approach, the approach of the process of design and what is the proceeding, how it does work in the mind of a great practitioner. So today is a great, great day because we do have Tom Main. So Tom Main is from Morphosis Architects. For some of you, maybe there are no need to present him, but for the one that it's still necessary, I may basically do it. And I wanted Tom actually to stay here, sitting, because maybe his modesty will be just fitting there. Tom Main is a man who achieved distinction throughout the world as a theorist, an author, a teacher, but for me at least as an architect. So he's the principal, the founding principal of an architecture firm that is working in urban planning, in research, and it's based in Los Angeles. You founded it in '72, and you are working on very wide variety of projects from schools, museum, towers, city planning. So what else? Tom is also a distinguished professor that leads the Now Institute in New York City. He's also dedicating in applying design thinking in real-world issues that we are facing and cities facing today. In honors, you're also a recipient of the Pritzker in 2005, correct? And you're also the gold medal of the Institute of Architectures, American Institute of Architecture. He has been the president of the committee during the Obama Turner of the Art and Humanity. And today, Tom Main will be just explaining what did he think when he came up with this installation that you just can see just behind here. So I can go on and on. This is a lot of recognition, but I would like just to simply say we're so honored to have Tom Main here on stage. So please welcome Tom Main in a round of applause.
Well, it's interesting, the title, Matter. I was just kind of thinking that, having a cup of coffee. And it seems so general to me, I didn't even know kind of how to grasp it. But in essence, I assume most of you are architects, is that correct? Or in the design community?
How many architects in a room? Raise their hands.
Okay, so they're a mix. But you could say that the most basic definition of an architect is we concretize. We utilize matter in the physical world, and we translate this world in conceptual terms and in performance terms. And what I'm going to discuss in this brief half an hour, which very possibly will be kind of obviously connected to the exhibit, because what you're looking at in the exhibit is a framework of how we think and how we conceive our ideas. In a way, it's a representation of our brain, our collective brain. And hopefully it'll be fairly kind of obvious that there'll be a connection between the work and what you're looking at in the exhibit, and very particularly having to do with operational strategies, the method of how we work, and very specifically the relationship in the digital world, and how that has radically shifted our thinking, which would be evident again in the conversation I'm talking about. I'm going to quickly go through 5 pieces of work, and the the broader narrative is going to have to do with the relationship of architecture as a cultural act and as a civic art form, having to do with the more complex, artistic, conceptual, interpretive notions of architecture and its relationship to, let's say, science, the more rational, the performative, the obligations of our discipline, right? That will start with its social functions and its relationship to the environment. It was interesting because as we were talking amongst ourselves, the notion of, and it happened through our conversation in the last months with Dassault, there was quite a bit of conversation on the environment, and I'm going to take kind of a particular approach to that because it's our sense that the beginning of this was in the middle 90s, and we're way along in this process, and this is not a kind of a new kind of a territory for architects. This is something that we're in our third or fourth generation that'll come up in the work. Okay, I'm starting with a kind of an odd project, but it's the one that kind of begins the conversation in terms of performance, and that when I started our practice in the mid-70s, and as it progressed through the 80s and the early 90s, I was very focused on the culture of architecture as an artistic act, and I was interested in the autonomy of architecture artistically, and fighting for the formal, the aesthetic, the conceptual kind of aspects of our craft, and like any of you that started with small practices, the work was commensurate with that practice. And as the work grew in scale, it was more or less a natural kind of process that the performance and its the consequence of architecture was gaining power because of the scale of the work and because of the nature of the publicness, in this case, of the work. And so that this was one of our first large commissions we'd won on a competition. When we got this building, a series of things changed in the practice, and it began with performance, and then we had a building for the state of California, a government building, and it became clear that its relationship to environment became one of the primary aspects of the building as we were representing a public entity. And with that, it was the beginning of a discussion of surface. And again, all of you are, I'm sure, the surface has been a preoccupation with architecture, and it's been directly connected to the digital world, because one of the first things happened with the digital world is it allowed us a much more complex language that had to do with surface, and I would have said it's been a preoccupation of the academic world globally since, the middle 90s or something, right? And so we did this, and it started with the surface, and for me it went directly back to late modern ideas that had to do with architecture's ability to control environmental kind of processes through the skin. And out of that came this, and the notion of something that was very particular to Los Angeles, and to something that was very kind of graphic as it made up its language. And then the public space was dominated by it was a very kind of active environment that was parallel to the cinematographic kind of sensibility of Los Angeles, etc. But again, what's going to happen immediately is there's going to be a connection between the broader purpose of the reading of the building and its performance. And it's going to be, probably in most cases, I'm going to repress the environmental, not interested in documenting a machine. It just operates in the way it should operate in terms of its efficiency, etc. But its interests are going to be multiple, because architecture is never about a single thing, right? It's always about the interaction of a series of forces. Well, then when we get to San Francisco, what's changing, and I think we're in the beginning of this in terms of a profession is that the work is becoming more strategical. And other than seeing ourselves as pure designers, that we're realizing that the work comes with obligations which are strategic. And what's happening is in the very early stages of the building, we're including a broader group of people that in this case include engineering, OVERP, et cetera, that are establishing the terms of the project. And so instead of thinking it immediately in terms of a design, we're looking at forming the project itself. And the formation of the project has to do with establishing the terms, again, the various obligatory terms of the performances of the building. And in this case, it's going to have to do with rethinking the workplace, rethinking the urban environment, and enforcing the urban environment, and pushing the notion of performance in a very kind of a very strong way that kind of rethinks this kind of building in its relationship to energy. And what's going to come out of that is a building where we've removed the air conditioning. And again, I'm very aware of speaking in Europe in general, Italy in specific, that the U.S. is a bit more primitive in terms of its notion towards energy. So some of the things we're doing here are kind of very kind of early kind of beginnings in the States that are something more commonplace depending where we are in the European community. Because I could have shown projects we're working in Austria, and we had brought back a lot of that kind of knowledge kind of early on as we're working internationally. But we're going to look at something, and what's happening now is the notion of performance and the environmental response is starting to shape the building, not a broad or a conceptual idea, but the thing itself is getting thin, and it's the shaping of the building is in fact developing its ability to solve the problem. And then with that, it's directly connected to its social relationship. And what's been going on today in the, whether it's the commercial, definitely in the academic world, there's been a radical kind of shift in the notion of the workplace, again, very much having to do with the digital world, and there's been a continued interest in the blurring between work, leisure, culture, health. And it's been doing this, and it's been challenging the notion of the singularity of the workplace. And that's going to show up in our last project I'll show you. And that's going to be part of this notion. And it's never losing sight of our architectural interests, which are all going to be about differentiation and a certain level of complexity that operates within a dynamic framework and communicates that dynamicism. That's been my life interest, is an architecture that has a voice which communicates the dynamic. An interior space that represents the status of federal headquarters in San Francisco, the status of the federal government, and then again the surface, and now we're pushing it in a much more kind of aggressive way, and it's going to be varied surfaces depending on orientation. So the first one was metal, and it's moving, and it's blocking 50. It's only allowing 50% of the light in and dealing with heat. The other one is dealing with wind. That's going to have to do with the circulation of the building, and like the human body, it's going to have multiple skins that have to do with performances having to do with that orientation and the forces, right, that it's dealing with this orientation. And this notion of performance is now leading the formal, or it's itself shaping kind of your formal ideas of how you interpret these needs. And what's taking place is we're producing something of huge kind of efficiencies. I'm missing the 10. 10 of these buildings produces, it will give total energy for a town of 24,000 people. And so again, we're also dealing with, and it's going to have to do with the exhibit you're looking at, there's been a continual kind of shift in the last 2 decades of dealing with our work at micro and macro levels simultaneously. And it's, for an architect, absolutely an incredibly kind of useful kind of aspect of how we think creatively, so we can operate within a micro level and discuss the nature, in this case, or a middle level of the response of a building, and we can understand that within urban terms of its consequence of city making, right? And it's the way we understand architecture today. We understand it within its broader architectural, cultural, political, economic, urbanistic, infrastructural sense, right? That's how we can place an understanding of the work that's outside of the aesthetic. Well, then we're looking at the Emerson School, the School of Music in Los Angeles, and now there's kind of two things happening, and it's going to have a little bit to do with kind of how we make things, and that again, if we go back to the notion of matter and shaping matter is the most basic definition of what we do. We're kind of looking at a work that's going to have to do with both its formation as an organization, as a form, and in relationship to a series of surfaces, and it's all going to be about the usefulness of developing a model that's very specific to Los Angeles, the dynamicism and the kineticness of Los Angeles and its relationship to education. And in this case, a school in Boston and a connection between the vast difference of the nature of a city of Boston and Los Angeles that kind of triggered kind of a lot of the thinking. And it's going to be, it's going to start with a making of public space and the connectivity of an academic environment. And in this case, we had this kind of perfect site that was sitting on Sunset Boulevard looking at the Hollywood sign that was kind of the classic, the kind of icon of Los Angeles. And then the surfaces that make this, that are these very complex, very active, highly differentiated kind of edges, which also relate to the making of the hand. There's a specificity that connects to the handmadeness. And then interested the compression of space, a very, very kind of active set of spaces which are between things and which are found and which could be seen as just about accidental. And I'm going to end with that, having to do with an interest in organizing randomness, or organizing the idiosyncratic, or organizing chance behavior, which are just about oxymorons, right? And it's my personal interest, and everything here has to do with a very particular spatial idea, which are found spaces, but not traditionally organized and not traditional in any way to a Cartesian model. And then two of these I'm going to talk about that's going to directly connect to the installation there at Dassault is the notion of how we produce things today within the digital world. And we're able to construct three-dimensionally, right? And the plan and the section are now CAT scans. They're secondary kind of ways of looking at something. And we can work in a very kind of quick way, shaping and resolving the various issues that we're promoting in terms of the definition of our project, and they're modeled 3D, et cetera, and we're moving very, very quickly, right? And we're moving a huge increase in thinking time and less in manual labor, less in mechanical time, huh? And we're looking reiteratively at our work as we continue to critique it, and it's proceeding in a very, very different way, and we're able to understand it within multiple terms. We can look at it as a design object. We can look at it in terms of its response to environmental behavior, to structure, to mechanics, to different levels of tectonics, etc. And our outputs are getting closer and closer to the making process early on. So we're, if you're looking at this, I'm not even sure what it's a drawing, I guess, because it looks like a drawing. but it's actually a virtual model of the thing itself, right? And it's not a drawing. It's actually the virtual thing, and we're building and constructing something. And again, it's an incredibly different way of thinking about how to design things today versus drawings, that we're constructing the thing itself, right? And we're constructing it virtually before we produce it. And so it's also pushing architecture to be re-engaged with construction, and it's just about inseparable at this point for us. And that as we're doing this, we're working immediately with the makers, the subcontractors in this case, right? This is Zahner in Kansas City. And the space between the office and the contractor, the construction industry is closing, right? And so here we are, and we're working with the prototype, and we're getting feedback from the construction process into the design process at a much earlier stage. That gives us this. And then on the surface, it's the same thing. So we're looking for a highly differentiated surface, right? And we're producing ideas that take place here, and then we're looking at the construction of that comes from very straightforward. This is a 4x8 piece of aluminum, and we're looking at the shaping that makes that, and that we're immediately connected to the construction process, and the design process, again, are completely singular. And we develop a roadmap for even the attachment of these pieces. And we're in charge of that process, right? And so again, architecture is moving, taking more and more responsibility for the constructional act, which it's in some ways moving back to the Middle Ages, that we're constructing something, but we're constructing it virtually prior to making it in real physical terms. And then it's giving us this. And it allows us, again, to produce things that would have been impossible 20 years ago, because we have tools out that produce highly complex things within extremely simplistic methodology. And then again, that surface, our project consulted for the Cologne group, and we're kind of expanding this notion of surface, which is going to be about the environment, and that's leading to kind of a very different piece of work. And then we get to the interior, and where the skin is going to have to do with one set of operations, which is environmental, and again, producing a very efficient envelope. The interior now, we're using a similar idea of skin, but it has to do with, in this case, the product of this research group. They make high-tech fabrics. Your airbag would come from them, right? And we're actually making something incredibly specific to this particular piece of work that uses the output of their own research, right? And dealing with skin in a very different way, the spatial. And this is all the public, the space, the connective space. And then again, on the exterior, the skin is literally, this is one of their divisions. They have a fashion division. And so we're showing this, that is an understanding that literally the skin of the body is something that is exactly how we think of the work itself, right? And we're looking at the second skin. And in this case, we're developing an idea that, as Krenza Harris in front of me, as we're sitting down working, we're starting with the idea of fabric as something that's connected to the client in terms of their processes, and we're now seeing how that connects and leads us to various formal opportunities, right? That have to do with the relationship of that, and some of it will now be directly connected to performance. That it has to do with a certain kind of percentage of covering. 5 minutes, thank you. And and so it has to do with kind of standard kind of views, etc. And then out of that comes this idea. And again, this is in our studio, and we're highly engaged in the realization of this idea as it shows up in South Korea, and as they're prototyping the piece, and then on the building that gives us this. And then now we're kind of operating at a very, very different scale, and we're at the kind of edge of technology, GFRP, and again, both a formal and a performative set of operations that are absolutely dependent on today's technology in terms of how we think, i.e. the exhibit you're looking at here. And then finally, Dallas. Okay, they said they have 5 minutes, so I've got to get out of here. The second notion of the first one had to do with skins. That have to do with the boundary of an envelope, having to do with performance. The second one is using ground and a notion of landscape. And that's, for me, a much more kind of a potent kind of idea. And it's going to show up at our building in Dallas for a museum. And the beginning is the shaping of the ground. And the ground is now seen as part of a typology. It's part of the building. And we're looking at kind of developing a whole new idea of ground and the traditional building. Morphology and typology come together to make the piece of work. And it's going to be very didactic. People understand the notion of this, and it'll end with that. So the first drawings aren't the building, they're shaping the ground. And this is also occupying a huge amount of it's producing for the program, and it's going to start with the shaping of that. And the relationship now of landscape and architecture are becoming more singular, right? And the landscape is playing a stronger and stronger role in defining the project. And again, we're hands-on. We're shaping the skin again in concrete. It's coming out of the studio. And so when we're there, Corenza, are you in this picture? We missed you in this. In the other one, we are producing this as a product, and we're highly involved in the nature of this skin and the complexities that take place with that. And then this was really fascinating. They're advertising and selling the product, and this was 6 months before the building opened. And again, it's the continued role of architects as they're moving more and more into matter in a literal sense, right? Where we're not designers, we're developing things that include the products that are relevant to our ambitions. And then quickly, the last one, which is really, I could have just stopped with this one. I thought it was really important as kind of a singular idea, is this connection between and I'm going to put it in kind of simple terms, of the art of architecture, the conceptual desires of architecture, the culture of architecture, versus pragmatics, which are building, right? Our interest conceptually, and how architects operate within performative terms, their obligations socially and culturally and environmentally, etc. And so I'm starting with a drawing, and I've been working on a series of drawings which are about chance behavior and an interest in willfulness and chance, and I'm looking for more complex organizational ideas. And they're going to finally end in things that are probably more urban in scale. And so here you can see 3 of those drawings that I'm using a similar technique as we develop something that's somewhat plan-like, let's say. It's the beginning kind of a sketch for this project. And it's going to be a research center in Shanghai. And it's fairly good scale. It's close to 1 kilometer long. And now I'm going to kind of take it apart and kind of organize it within more architectural terms. And I'm going to organize it in terms of landscape and architecture and environmentally. So it says there it's 45% landscape. And we're going to find a new kind of language of something that's part landscape and part building.
You split all of that by systems, you know. It's just layers of systems.
Yeah. And then it's going to translate that language into plans.
Yeah.
It gives us that in conventional ways. And then, again, we have this incredibly kind of integrated process where very early on we're taking responsibility for how you make it structurally. And you're looking at something that, again, literally a decade ago couldn't have been done. 12,000 plus or minus discrete steel pieces that are all different. And it's irrelevant. because they're cut by a computer anyway. It's all automated, right? And it's irrelevant. And so this is taking place in the office, and this is what we're coming up with in the building itself, right? And this level of complexity. And this is an average cost building. This is not an extreme building. Wrap it up. I got it. And but it takes this kind of responsibility, and we end up with this. And what we're looking at is a new prototype with something between nature and building. Everything you're looking at is used. Whether it looks like landscape or building, it's all part of the project. And it deals with a complexity and a differentiation, where as you move through it, every space is different, but it's organized and it's coherent, right? It's and it comes out of the original ideas of the drawings that are looking for different notions of organization, and it's filled with chance behavior, with accidents, with quote mistakes, right? And I'm fascinated in a work that goes beyond your own comprehension, and it's the same what's on the pieces you're looking at there. We're aware that we're showing information which is impossible to be processed in a singular way, that it goes beyond your own capacity to do that. And we end up with this. And it also, I'm going to kind of end with a notion that it affects your own, the way you've originally defined yourself as a designer, having to do with control and having to do with the final act of design, and then it's pushing that way beyond that notion. And then what we're doing is we're producing things that we couldn't imagine, that we couldn't preconceive a priori, based on the tools we're working with, right? And the tools take us someplace, right, that's beyond our own imaginative powers. And then with that comes the collective act, that it operates as a system that connects a team of creative people working on a singular project. Because I'd have said the idea of a singular architect is totally over. It's a 19th century idea. The single genius that comes out of here is absolutely old school, right? That we work in a completely different way today. And then again, out of that comes this variation that I'm looking for, that's parallel to looking or analyzing a city that developed over centuries. I'm interested in that kind of a complexity, that kind of variety, that kind of differentiation that takes place as our projects get larger and larger, and we have less and less time to develop the scale of the work that we're involved in. And again, a very kind of modern environment that's seen work, leisure, culture, health, etc. as part of that. And then finally, the last comment will be, everything I'm talking about is going to have extended value in larger urban scale projects, which would be a completely different conversation. It would be a much more complicated, long kind of conversation. But as the scale increases, the conversation we're having to do with the necessity of more complex organizational ideas and the ramping up of understanding the layers of performances is going to become more and more kind of powerful and necessary, and is going to represent the most kind of compelling projects for architects in this century. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you. This has been very strong. I don't know how much time we have left, but you basically answer a lot of questions. This huge, genealogy coming from this performance, and how the architect is taking more and more responsibility to the larger scales of the urban planning. But it's no more urban planning. It's just this full integration of all of the functions you were just like nicely laying out. How much time do we have? Do we have time for some questions? Okay. I have plenty of questions, but I would like to open up to the audience before, because I know we can talk. So, any question for Tom? Mette.
Hi. I was interested in, if we are looking at a sort of future material system, which is what we're discussing today, and what you're presenting is sort of a very high articulation of where we are, what state of the art of building is now. So industrialized steel construction, concrete construction, the finishes are perfect and so on. What do you, from your perspective of the office, think about future materials or future material practice?
That I'm not sure that it's absolutely irrefutable. There's going to be a continued interest in that. We're the nature of our practice, I don't think would be different than most people. That we're somewhat limited in our research because of the scale of the architecture, the way architects work and the scale, etc. How can I answer this? So if we're looking at the project in Seoul, Korea, we're absolutely kind of pushing the state of the art in material terms and in the gestalt of the thing itself, right? And the making of it, and it's definitely state of the art.
And by the way, how it was done with.
But the actual material,
yes.
The company, the Cologne Group is in the thousands, 7,000 people. They do that as an industry. They reinvent chemically, physically, the material itself, right? And I think we're just alert, and we're absolutely connected to those processes, because like the methods we're working with, and like the tools, the digital tools we work with, they require the same kind of advancement of the methods of making, which require new materials. The one that's been obvious for now, again, by the middle 90s, it was already evident that the language was radically changing, and it included double curves, right? And the problem we talk about with any architect in exterior is the nature of the limited amount of materials that can produce the work that we produce in our conceptual phase. And so we're waiting, right, for the nature of that kind of expansion. And it'll happen without any question, because there's a desire for the need for that. And everything is pointing towards a direction that has to do with a broader biological direction of materials, which would probably be parallel to the medical profession and how they're looking today at carcinogens. I mean, it's gone to a molecular level, and they understand now medicine within terms that again could have been understood a couple decades ago. And I think this is happening in a parallel way in our profession. A little slower maybe, because it's not driven by kind of the demands of medicine. It's more by the potential of form making in an architectural sense.
Plus, you need the connection to the industry, because you are building in large scale. So you need the industry capacity on the top of it. If you do this, you have to have the link being established.
Yep.
Something you were also showing is the connection of material with the place you were basically situating your building. You know, you can see maybe now the possibility within those constraints on performance to actually apply when we were doing in the pre-industrial era the material that was right there. You know, just being more connected with the local quality and tradition and what is at hand. Is it something that you...
But that's really a difficult one too, because I think the demands of architecture as an art form are quite different than industrial design. If you were a painter, a sculptor, a musician, shaping sound, and that my experience has been architecture is... There's an expectation of continuity, of cultural continuity in architecture, as us as habitual characters that have expectations for that continuity, that connect to our family structures, our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents. And there's a sensibility about place, our town, the specific living environment, etc., that is something quite different than other art forms, right?
It's just almost into different lines.
So 5 minutes for the questions. That's for her, not for me. So there's always going to be a tension between the state of the art materials that are taking us into a very different visual world, and to the notion of localized, you build brick or you build stone or you find connective tissue, and that's going to be a continuation that happens. And of course, we're working under extremely fascinating political, social, cultural times, that we're in a place at this point of history where our global stature which was identified by the modernists in the end of the 19th century, right, is now a reality, and where there's a discussion about the nature of us as and our location and our what it means to be a nationality, and that's a whole conversation, yes, which as architects is inescapable. So you're producing a work in Dubai or in Mexico City, in Sao Paulo or Italy or in Beijing or in Boston, and it's the same architectural firm, and you're moving from place to place, and part of that is inevitable in terms of how we operate within economic terms, within political terms, within cultural terms. And yet there is probably still a majority of the population which would still prefer the indigenous, the notion of your connection to a particular culture. And it's without taking a position, I think it's irrelevant, it just is. And it's the nature of where we are at this particular time, and it's going to be a continuing conversation. But it'll definitely have to do with the way you define matter, right? And because it's going to the directions that all of the modern, all the contemporary directions are going to lead us away from the indigenous. There's no question, because these things didn't exist, right? And that's going to be a continued that'll be a continued construct without any question in the coming decades. That's going to be a continuing conversation.
One more question?
Thanks. Do you see architecture also as an act of resistance, as Renzo Piano thinks? And what is the part of technology in this act of resistance?
That's interesting, because that was the beginning of my career. Everything was resistance, and that was the role of architecture when I was 28 years old. And it seemed to be an operational strategy which was viable in the 70s and 80s, maybe through the middle 90s. And I would have said today, and as a teacher, that's no longer a viability in the pure sense, and that I think our role is much more connected to an engagement and a continued evolution of our work within that engagement. But there's still clearly a necessity for, let's say, instead of a resistance, an understanding of the importance of an autonomy of our discipline, and that autonomy represents the voice that's specific to architecture vis-a-vis the other people at the table. Make sense?
Yes.
It's a nuance, but not. You're shaking your head, yeah? And that you could say that's still resistance, but I would say it's more because the resistance is such a powerful. It was such a powerful notion that drove my generation, right? But I'd have said today it's more autonomy, understanding the necessity of engagement, yes, because that was at a time where I wore it as a badge. It had nothing to do with the status quo, and I could do that as an architect. But I could do that at a smaller scale, and I could do it within an academic world, and I could do it within a conceptual world. Make sense? And as you get more engaged in reality, and as that just takes place naturally in your studio, it's impossible it's not a possible tack, because in fact, if anything, it's moving quite in the opposite direction. That the engagement is ramping up, and it's evident in the work, I think, and it's the engagement is increasing both in the tectonic act, the constructional act, as well as in various connections whether it be environmental, or whether it be social or cultural, etc., which is a necessity, right? And your shift moves more towards, I think, innovation, a more positive kind of spin on the same notion. But autonomy, absolutely.
Well, thank you, Tom. This may conclude this, autonomy. I completely agree in the process of participative design. This is what we need. Thank you, Tom. Thank you for your time. I think you deserve a huge round of applause, please.
Thanks.